Good morning or afternoon or wherever you are. This is videos for the grade 9s. This is going to be me talking about chapters 4 to 6 on the Golden Compass. Things are really heating up in the Golden Compass now. In chapter 3, of course, we saw this poor little kid, Tony Macarios, get abducted by, it turns out, Mrs. Coulter, this beautiful, dark woman with a golden monkey demon. What's one of the things to note about the golden monkey is never speaks. One of the few demons that we get so much exposure to as the story goes on that never seems to talk. It's it's fascinating. Anyway, she kind of leads this boy in and abducts him. That was chapter 3. Now in chapter 4, of course, Mrs. Coulter shows up at Oxford, right, which is just incredible. One of the things I wanted to focus on in our study is Lyra is quite sexist. On chapter 4, on the very first page of chapter 4, Lyra asks her, "Are you a female scholar?" And she regarded female scholars with the proper Jordan disdain. Poor things. They could never be taken more seriously than animals dressed up and acting a play. Like, that is a horribly sexist thing to say. And, Lyra says that, but that's how she's been raised, right? So we see that that sexism is odd. Mostly our heroes, our protagonists aren't sexist, right? But she is, and that even gets reinforced later. The word female only suggested female scholars to Lyra, and she involuntarily made a face. So she has no admire. She doesn't want to be like feminine, that social gender identity of feminine, and she's like, the word feminine and female is just yuck, disgusting, right? So she's quite an odd, ironic opposite, isn't she, Lyra? So okay, so I made that point. That was interesting, that she's actually quite sexist. Now, some interesting things that happen in that is she meets the master after this dinner where Lyra is just enamored with Mrs. Coulter, right? Mrs. Coulter represents adventure, and she wants to go to the north, and she's an explorer, and she's a woman, and Lyra really just wants this, right? I think one of the things maybe that people have noted is, even though Lyra denies it, and the master brings it up, he says, you need female guidance, and Lyra's like, no, I don't. Well, maybe she does, because she almost subconsciously is just drawn to Mrs. Coulter. But then again, it seems that everyone is drawn to Mrs. Coulter. She seduces Tony Macarios, right, to come with her, and then she abducts him. So Mrs. Coulter is like this dangerous attraction, especially for young people, right? So Lyra is sucked in. She's incredibly powerful and dark. And Lyra's going to see her soon as a guide, right? You see in this section that Lyra goes off to live with her. So the two people we have in charge of Lyra's life, really her parent figures, Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter, are really, again, not nice people. One is aggressive and ferocious and uncaring, and Mrs. Coulter is seductive and psychotic. It's amazing. One of the things the master says on page 72, she says, he tells her that she's going to go live with Mrs. Coulter, the master says, and he says, I can't prevent it. And Lyra didn't notice at the time what an odd thing to say that was. It's interesting. This is one of those chapters where if you could go back after you read the book, you'd realize how important a lot of these points were. One of the things is that she gets the alethiometer, right? She gets this object that tells the truth. It's interesting to note that you see another alethiometer in the series if you read on, or the master can kind of read it with his books, but it takes him weeks to get a vague response. By the end of this novel, Lyra is so good at reading the alethiometer, she just has to really look at it, and she can tell the truth. And why a child is so good at seeing the truth versus a learned scholar. Anyway, she gets the alethiometer, and one of the things that's, I think, so important is on page 73 when she says, what were you going to say about Uncle Asriel? Because the alethiometer was given to the college by the Lord Asriel, and the master is telling Lyra what to do. In the middle of 73, she tried to look up at him and said, what were you going to say about Uncle Asriel? And he says, your uncle presented to Jordan College some years ago. He might. Before he could finish, there came a soft, urgent knock on the door. She could feel his hands give an involuntary tremor. Quick now, child. So he never gets to finish that sentence. And because he never gets to finish that sentence, a whole series of events are going to go into motion. When you finish this book, you'll appreciate how different things would have been on 2 points in this chapter. That's the first one. If he had finished that sentence, which I'm not going to spoil it for you, what he would have said, so many things would have been different. And then the next page, she goes back to the room and Mrs. Lonsdale's packing her up. And she was going to put it in the suitcase, but the master gave it. Mrs. Lonsdale said, "What's that you've got?" Closing the battered little suitcase at the snap. "The master gave it to me. Can't it go in the suitcase? Too late. I'm opening it now." And Lyra can't put it in the suitcase, right? If it had gone in the suitcase, again, guys, if you read the book, man, things would have gone so different. So that is just an amazing chapter for how plot just took a turn, really. Anyway, what you want to notice about Mrs. Coulter is she's psychotic. That moment when she tells Lyra to take off the shoulder bag, and Lyra says no, and like in an instant, Mrs. Coulter attacks her and just dominates her, right? The monkey, Lyra's demon, is totally dominated by Mrs. Coulter's demon, and that means the battle is over, right? Because when Pantalaimon feels pain, so does Lyra. And the monkey just attacks Pantalaimon, and then, okay, fine. And what is amazing to me is how quickly Mrs. Coulter becomes aggressive and how quickly she stops. And then she's like, "Now kiss me." Like, she is just crazy, Mrs. Coulter. It's just incredible, right? And then at the party, we see another instance of how dangerous Mrs. Coulter is when Lyra's talking to that reporter. And Mrs. Coulter comes along and the reporter is terrified. We don't know what happens to the reporter, but we never see her again. So we really start to get a sense of the dark forces involved in this situation and how evil Mrs. Coulter is, truly. And one of the things they talk about is that Lyra is talking to one of the guests, she finds out that Mrs. Coulter is in charge of the General Oblation Board. And that's why, he says, that's why she's so valuable, meaning Mrs. Coulter. They must want to take part, and what child could resist her? So whatever these kids are being used for, Mrs. Coulter's in charge of it, and she's crucial to it, and Lyra learns that. So what does she do? Of course, she escapes Mrs. Coulter after so long of being with her. It's incredible. And then, of course, in chapter 6, she leaves. She practices her lying skills. She lies to a really creepy guy at the coffee shop. She lies really quickly, which I think was a good idea, because that guy it was just an odd situation. If you I'm sure you picked it up too. Weird. At this little coffee stand, she's on the run and she lies her way out of it. But then she gets kidnapped or saved by the Egyptians, and you're going to learn a lot about the Egyptians. The Egyptians are pretty incredible people, like gypsies, and they take Lyra on their boats, and she is going to meet a new parent figure, Ma Costa, and Farder Coram and John Fa, these people that are going to be her new family, even though she doesn't really belong. So anyway, that's chapters 4, 5, and 6. I'm sure you have other points. If there's anything you noted, please let me know. But here's where we're going, guys. Remember, we're going to read chapters 4, 5, 6 this week. There'll be a quiz on Monday the 11th on chapters 1 to 6. It's a quiz, just to make sure you're on track. Then you're going to read 7, 8, and 9 next week. And there'll be a test on chapters 1 to 9, because that's the first section of one of 3 of the book. Okay, so that's where we're going. And that big test on chapters 1 to 9 will be for marks. That's a huge, but it's a test on chapters 1 to 9. Okay, bye.